Hey there. So, one of the things I'd really like to do in this space as I begin to cultivate this inner room is I'd really like to talk about from time to time in a sort of more informal way some of the things that I will write about um, related to being human and inner emotional life. And you'll note from my first essay that I posted that loneliness is a theme that I explore, I enjoy writing about, I enjoy thinking about, I teach about quite extensively. And in the last 15, 20 years, among many other topics, as a psychologist, as an author, as a scholar, I've had the opportunity to explore loneliness in a lot of depth. And I'm not here suggesting that what I say here are truths, but I do want to say that there are five things about loneliness that I think are really important to note for anybody who, one, feels loneliness, and two, even thinks about it and gives it some attention. And I'm going to try really quickly here to go through those five things to give you an idea or maybe even a different perspective on loneliness. And hopefully, by the time this video ends, you would at least have opened the door to questioning loneliness in a slightly different way. So I guess I will call this five myths of loneliness. And the first one I want to talk about is that loneliness is not necessarily a disease to be cured. But I think that that is the dominant story that's told about loneliness. And I think that's one of the things we really need to keep in mind, that the dominant story we are told about it and the dominant story we are telling about loneliness is very much this idea that loneliness is a pathology. It's an experience that humans have that we should try to stamp out. And I've had so many people over the years come to me with this kind of idea that, okay, we want to make loneliness a stranger. We want to get rid of loneliness. There's a campaign to end all loneliness. Let's abolish loneliness. Loneliness kills more people than cigarettes. There's these alarmist health related messages about loneliness that talk about it as though it's some sort of psychological, spiritual, emotional pathology that we need to get rid of. My first point is that's not necessarily a truth, it's a story about loneliness. And I would argue that there's other ways of looking at loneliness which might suggest loneliness is an inevitable part of being alive sometimes. Sometimes we have to feel lonely, and it's appropriate to feel lonely. And loneliness may be something that's here to teach us something or has a message that we need to learn from or understand something about. And so, if we only dress it up as a pathology to get rid of really quickly, we risk missing that possibility. Now, I could say a lot more about that, but I don't want to here in this short sort of list of what I call the myths of loneliness. But it's not the only story we could tell about loneliness, is my point. The fact that loneliness is a pathology and something to be cured is a particular narrative about it that we peddle and is dominantly peddled in Western societies that doesn't have to be the way that we look at it. And if we only look at it one way, we risk missing other stories about loneliness we might tell. We also risk people quite quickly stigmatizing loneliness. And people who feel it quite naturally and quite understandably frequently may well drive it underground because they see it as a deficit about themselves. So we have to be very careful about that. And I have a lot more to say on that myth. And I'm currently writing another book about that particular myth at the moment. Second myth about loneliness, there's a sort of default knee jerk reaction that people often make that seems to suggest that if you feel lonely, the one thing you're going to need is other people, and that there's some sort of solution or magic bullet in relation to alleviating loneliness. But that's not always the case. And in my own research and in my own, just my own capacity to talk to people who are lonely, I'd say that other people are not always the solution to loneliness. And actually, frequently, they can be the cause of loneliness. I've spoken to many, many people over the years who it very quickly becomes apparent that the essence of their loneliness is people, as in my family or my marriage or the place I work or the place I live. I've never felt more alone than when I'm with the people that I'm supposed to be close to. They make me feel lonely, or I feel lonely around them because I'm unseen, or I'm invisible, or they don't know me, or I hide myself. So often people can be the cause of loneliness, they can be the cause of it. And they're not always the solution either. Sometimes I've heard people say, I really wish that these people who are trying to help me wouldn't think that the solution is to put me with a load of strangers who are also feeling lonely and take us on a day trip, because that will somehow alleviate my loneliness. It makes me feel more lonely. So remember, other people are not always the solution to loneliness. It's much more complicated than that. Three, there's this idea, and it's a really important myth here. There's not really, in my experience, one thing called loneliness. And anyone who says that they feel lonely is talking about that. I would argue that in all of the years I've talked to people and researched and really listened to what loneliness is about, one of the core things that comes across is loneliness is really never the same thing. If you have 100 people in front of you who all tell you they're lonely, they're actually all talking about very different things. And the only way you can really understand what they mean when they say they're lonely is listening to what loneliness means for them. So, in a way, it's a bit like a snowflake. Everyone's experience of loneliness has a unique pattern and story and biographical experience behind it. And if you don't listen to how what that person means when they feel lonely, you really don't know what you're dealing with. So, I would argue that the idea that there's a thing called loneliness is probably a bit of a linguistic myth. It's not. I don't think it's real. And I think that loneliness is many different things, and you've got to understand the story of loneliness for each person to really begin to understand that, and then even begin to support that or alleviate that if that's necessary. I also think it's really important, and this is like the fourth myth: being alone certainly doesn't need to be synonymous with loneliness. The two are not the same thing in any way, shape, or form. And as I already said, I've talked to many people who'd say, and I think actually I'm probably one of those people too, that when I'm alone with myself, that's when I feel least lonely, actually. I can often feel very lonely in situations where there are lots of people around me and I feel invisible or I can't be myself. So often for me, being alone is a space where I feel most um, alive and least lonely frequently. And in a similar vein, I know that a lot of people would say, when I'm not alone, I feel really lonely. So it's another myth. Being alone is not synonymous with feeling lonely. And then I think number five, and I can remember somebody saying to me at a talk I gave around loneliness some weeks ago, it's great, it's all very well, this person said, they put their hand up at the back and they said, it's all very well telling us that everybody feels lonely, but I would never want to talk about my loneliness with other people. And I think that another myth, in a way, is that we shouldn't talk about loneliness. We shouldn't share our loneliness with other people. And that myth, I think, comes from the idea that loneliness is some sort of leprosy, and anyone who feels it is in some way defective or has failed in some way to be a good citizen or a good person or a healthy person. And I think what the person was saying to me in the talk was they feel ashamed of their loneliness and they don't want to talk about it, so they wouldn't. And so suggesting that talking about loneliness as a solution doesn't make sense. And I'd say in response to that, that's probably because the story we tell ourselves about loneliness as a culture has driven it underground, has made it something shameful, something we shouldn't talk about or admit to. And so it's kind of hidden. And an awful lot of people I've talked to would have told me that loneliness is something they feel, but they tend to let it out in their living room when they're alone, when they shut the door at night in their house and acknowledge to themselves that they're lonely. But when they go out, they perform, and loneliness is something they hide. And I would argue that, again, it's a myth that loneliness needs to be that. It doesn't have to be that. So these are the 5 myths, I think, for me, that really need to be dispelled if we were to reconstruct what I would argue is a healthier version of a healthier idea of loneliness and relationship to loneliness. So I'll run through those again. One, loneliness is a disease to be cured. I think that's a myth. Myth number 2, other people are always the solution to loneliness. I think that's a myth. 3, all people experience loneliness the same way, and it's just this sort of universal term that means something objective. Myth, I think. I think that it's not. There are many, many ways to feel lonely, and there's as many kinds of loneliness as there are people who feel lonely. Being alone is synonymous with being lonely. It's a myth, I think. I don't think that's true. And loneliness is something we don't talk about and shouldn't talk about and shouldn't share. I disagree. I think that actually I've found in my own work that talking about loneliness may well be the best alleviator of loneliness we have. Paradoxically, sharing our loneliness with each other seems to make us feel less lonely. So there's a little outline for you of some of the key ideas about loneliness that I think I've come across in the last and developed in the last 15, 20 years of thinking about it. They're simple, but they're really important messages. So hopefully something might resonate, or you might feel slightly differently about loneliness, or have slightly different ideas about it after listening to those particular ideas. So again, thanks very much for listening. And if you've got any thoughts about loneliness yourself, I'd love to know what they are and to hear about those or read about them. So thanks very much, and hope you gained something from listening to this.